Opening the center immediately builds a strong claim to space and prepares rapid development. Developing the knight so early influences potential central pawn structures and offers flexibility for future piece placement. Asserting central influence, c4 immediately contests space and prepares for rapid development, aiming to restrict black's options. Solidifying the central pawn structure while preparing for piece development, this move prioritizes a safe, classical approach. Developing a knight to a central square reinforces pawn control and prepares for further piece activity, aiming to build a strong central presence. A bold pin on the knight, immediately contesting central influence and preparing for knight development behind its shadow. Undermining the central pawn structure while weakening your own king's safety, a curious sacrifice of solidity for attacking ambition. Challenging the center, black seeks to break open lines and create dynamic play despite the cramped pawn structure. Instigating a pawn confrontation to gain crucial central space often comes at the cost of weakening the queenside pawn structure. Trading the bishop for the knight immediately disrupts white's queenside pawn structure, creating a lasting weakness to exploit. Embracing the doubled pawns, white sacrifices pawn structure for a powerful central majority and open b-file, aiming for rapid development and central dominance. Securing the king behind a pawn shield offers immediate safety, but it also signifies a commitment to a more closed game, potentially limiting your queenside counterplay for now. Opening the c-file immediately intensifies the battle for central control, aiming to exploit the slightly compromised pawn structure after the pawn exchange. Reclaiming central space with the pawn is a key positional step, aiming to activate the queen and prepare for a potential queenside pawn advance, while white's doubled pawns on the c-file will require careful maneuvering to defend. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the bishop, this move aims to gradually improve white's pawn structure and central control. Securing the central pawns feels complete now. The knight's detour to the edge aims to exploit the open kingside flank later, potentially targeting the light squares after the pawn structure stabilizes, though it concedes valuable tempo and central influence for now. Fortifying the center and preparing for kingside action, the queen now eyes the weakened dark squares around black's castled monarch. The rook's journey to the open file, aiming to occupy the crucial e-file now that the central pawn structure is simplified, signals an intention to contest control and potentially launch an assault on white's uncastled king, while simultaneously reinforcing the pawn chain. Pushing this pawn aggressively opens up lines toward black's king, but it weakens white's own kingside significantly, creating potential targets for black's knights and bishops that could exploit the exposed squares, a risky gamble for central control that might backfire. Opening up lines for the queen and rook, black boldly sacrifices pawn structure for piece activity, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn majority and potentially exploit the weakened kingside. This knight's aggressive foray, though seemingly reckless, might unlock tactical opportunities by forcing white to commit their pieces defensively. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, this thrust aims to disrupt black's knight and open lines for potential attack, even if it does weaken the light squares around white's own king. Black bravely challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt the space advantage white secured with their pawn advances, potentially opening lines for their pieces. King activation, though often a late-game technique, is being pursued aggressively here, aiming to secure the monarch while potentially preparing for a central pawn push or even preparing to use the king as an attacking piece if the center opens dramatically. This daring repositioning might, however, leave the e-file slightly less protected in the immediate future. The knight embarks on an adventurous journey towards the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create attacking possibilities. But this knight maneuver exposes black to potential tactical skirmishes and a somewhat cramped queenside position. Aimed at disrupting black's central pawn structure and potentially opening lines against the king, this bishop development seeks to activate the piece and create pressure on the d5 pawn. Introducing the knight to c6 sharpens black's central presence and prepares to contest the d4 square, creating a more dynamic pawn structure and potentially unlocking lines for the queenside pieces. Channeling energy towards the kingside with the knight's repositioning, white aims to reinforce the pawn chain and potentially launch an attack, but sacrifices some immediate central control. Indeed, this knight's journey to e2 might be a precursor to maneuvering it to g3 for added attacking weight, or perhaps it's just a defensive retreat, a quiet repositioning to avoid tactical entanglements and prepare for future pawn pushes. Unleashing the bishop to e6 repositions it to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses around white's king and preparing to contest the d-file. Unleashing a pawn storm, white dramatically seeks to break open lines towards black's king, but this aggressive push simultaneously weakens the light squares around his own monarch and might overextend his pawn structure. Black now marshals forces to the c-file, a natural target given white's pawn structure on the queenside and the unprotected king. Unleashing a pawn storm, white immediately seeks to dislodge the knight and gain crucial kingside space, a bold but potentially risky endeavor that could open up lines for attack or leave the king exposed. A subtle repositioning begins, aiming to free the trapped knight from the pawn chain's vice and prepare for a potential sortie on the kingside, creating dynamic tension against white's advanced pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn storm to crack open the kingside, this aggressive thrust aims to shatter black's defensive pawn shield and expose the monarch. Opening the king's defenses so drastically with this pawn capture invites a dangerous cascade of threats, as the g-file now becomes a gaping wound leading directly towards your monarch, a scenario that demands immediate and precise defensive maneuvering to avoid being overwhelmed by white's advancing pawns and well-placed pieces. Unleashing the pawn storm, white opens the h-file, threatening immediate contact with black's king and demanding a decisive response to the pawn's aggressive penetration. Slamming the pawn forward now aims to disrupt white's attacking setup, but it exposes the f6 square and potentially weakens the kingside pawn structure even further if white can exploit the open g-file. Preparing to seize the b-file, white aims to bypass black's pawn chain and activate the queen, potentially creating threats along that open avenue towards the castled king. Opening up lines towards the kingside, black's knight ventures to the edge of the board aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially reroute to a more central outpost. Challenging the pawn chain's structural integrity now, the knight repositions to a potentially more active square, aiming to disrupt black's newly formed pawn barrier and create dynamic possibilities on the kingside. Black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create play on the queenside, a bold maneuver that opens up the c-file but potentially weakens the king's cover. Unlocking the c-file for your rook, a crucial strategic initiative, while simultaneously reinforcing the queenside and preparing to contest the open c-file with your queen. Embracing the open c-file, black repositions their rook, aiming to exert pressure on white's advanced pawn chain and disrupt the newly formed diagonal for the bishop. Unlocking the queenside for potential pawn advances or piece repositioning, this rook shift aims to bolster the b2 pawn and potentially eye the c-file. Reclaiming the central space after the pawn exchange presents an immediate challenge. Black's knight now aims to reintegrate into the fight, perhaps targeting that exposed kingside pawn structure that white has so eagerly erected. This ambitious pawn thrust aims to sever black's queenside influence, creating potential weaknesses on b6 and c5, but it simultaneously offers a pawn capture and potentially exposes the king's sanctuary. Stepping back from the immediate pawn skirmishes, this move boldly repositions the knight, aiming to reinforce the queenside and potentially challenge white's pawn structure. Unleashing the bishop to a potent diagonal, white forces black to reconsider the placement of the queen and the vulnerability of the weakened queenside pawn structure. Unleashing the queen to d7 reclaims central influence and prepares to challenge the advanced white pawns by potentially supporting a future b6 maneuver, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and exploit the isolated pawn on c3. Securing the b-file's dominion signals a clear intent to exert pressure along this open avenue, potentially targeting black's queenside structure or even preparing a rook lift. The pawn shield around black's monarch remains robust, offering a deceptive sense of security as the queenside begins to fray. Injecting a new threat along the b-file, the rook now eyes a potential infiltration into black's queenside, aiming to exploit the pawn weaknesses created by the earlier exchanges and put pressure on the pinned pieces. The knight's journey to b7, while seemingly passive, aims to reposition this piece to a more active square, potentially eyeing squares like d6 or c5, and importantly, it frees up the c8 rook to potentially swing over to the o or b files. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, white initiates a central confrontation, aiming to shatter black's pawn structure and exploit the open lines that will inevitably follow. Embracing a pawn exchange in the center, black initiates a dynamic recalculation of material and pawn structure, aiming to unlock potential tactical pathways despite the lingering awkwardness of the knight on b7. Reclaiming the center with the bishop, white boldly pins down black's pawn chain and aims to exploit the newly opened diagonal, setting the stage for a fierce battle for central control. A bold attempt to free the isolated d-pawn by offering a pawn sacrifice, aiming to disrupt white's solid central structure and open lines for black's rooks, though it risks creating further weaknesses if white can consolidate effectively. Seizing the initiative, white repositions the rook to a more active square, aiming to exploit the open e-file and potentially create threats against black's kingside. Unleashing the bishop to this central square ignites immediate tactical possibilities and disrupts white's already precarious pawn structure. Unleashing the knight to d5 creates a dazzling tactical geometry, aiming to pry open the c4 square for potential invasions while simultaneously eyeing weaknesses around black's still exposed king position. Embracing the chaos, black decides to shatter the center, opening critical lines for immediate counterplay. Sacrificing the knight opens a vital diagonal for the queen and prepares to exploit black's slightly uncoordinated pieces, especially after the pawn structure has been so aggressively manipulated. Unpacking this pawn structure with your king now exposed and facing open diagonals is a precarious decision, creating a domino effect of positional weaknesses that might be hard to recover from. The open g-file now presents a terrifying pathway to black's exposed monarch. White's immediate pawn thrust aims to rip open further lines, potentially leading to a swift mating attack that black, with his disorganized pieces and vulnerable king, will struggle to parry. Reclaiming the initiative after the exchange, this knight's repositioning aims to exploit the open files and threaten white's potentially exposed king. Striking at the heart of black's weakened kingside structure, this exchange severs crucial defensive lines and exposes the king to further assault. Unleashing the queen on this diagonal instantly rips open the kingside, creating an immediate threat that forces a difficult defensive calculation. The monarch voluntarily surrenders the relative safety of his original domicile, a risky gamble for central dominance amidst an unfolding tactical storm. Pouncing on white's exposed monarch, this capture unleashes a storm of tactical possibilities, aiming to shatter the defensive pawn shield around the king and open critical lines for the black pieces. Unleashing a devastating discovered attack, white's bishop transfer immediately shatters black's exposed monarch's defenses and seizes control of the vital diagonal, paving the way for decisive material gain or checkmate sequences. The doubled pawns on the c-file have been shattered, opening a precarious diagonal for black's queen to infiltrate and create immediate threats. A critical repositioning of the queen, seeking to exploit the open queen's file and pressure black's isolated pawns, while simultaneously offering a potential defensive retreat should the knight on c5 prove problematic. Swapping queens now amidst this wild chaos simplifies things dramatically, but look closely. The exposed white king, despite the material trade, is still a glaring vulnerability, especially with black's remaining pieces poised to exploit the open lines. Seizing the open file with the rook, white initiates a decisive sequence aiming to exploit black's exposed king and fractured pawn structure. The rook's return to the fifth rank dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating a doubled isolated pawn for white on the c-file, and offering black the immediate prospect of centralizing their remaining rook. The monarch's exposed position invites relentless pressure, leaving it vulnerable to the opponent's coordinated pieces as the game simplifies. The king, now exposed on the 7th rank after the rook trade, must find immediate sanctuary to avoid further harassment from the opposing pieces. Asserting control over the open h file with this rook repositioning seems intended to disrupt black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses for future advances. The pawn advances on the king's side, a bold gambit to open avenues, now forces the defender to find a way to neutralize this aggressive pawn push and prevent the enemy king from becoming exposed. Finally, a clear path opens for the rook to infiltrate the enemy position. A desperate bid to activate the rook, aiming to create a defensive wall and perhaps disrupt white's smooth coordination, though it sacrifices pawn structure and offers little immediate counterplay. Shifting the rooks to the open d-file offers white a chance to consolidate and potentially prepare a queenside pawn push, putting pressure on black's potentially isolated pawns. The black king, abandoning its shelter, ventures into the open, a bold gambit for active counterplay. Squeezing the opponent's king with an exposed pawn chain, while simultaneously fortifying your own king, provides a decisive positional advantage. The king's retreat to g7 signals a realization that the past few moves have created significant attacking potential for white, and now survival is the paramount concern. The rook's descent along the 7th rank, now reinforced by its counterpart, aims to suffocate black's position and exploit the weak pawns on the kingside, preparing for a decisive penetration. Pushing the pawn here is a desperate attempt to create a passed pawn, but it leaves the king even more exposed to the open files and the attacking pieces. Clearing the h-file allows the rook to penetrate aggressively into black's territory, threatening to dismantle the weakened pawn structure and directly attack the monarch. The pawn storm on the kingside, once a promising avenue for attack, now seems to have ground to a halt, leaving the black king in a precarious but surprisingly secure position due to the white piece's awkward placement. Your monarch's safety is paramount. Repositioning him is a wise consideration as the pawn storm advances, potentially creating escape squares. The black king, despite the material advantage, finds itself exposed in the center, a magnet for white's remaining pieces and a beacon for future attacks. Shifting the bishop to the long diagonal offers a new layer of defensive support for the king, while also eyeing potential threats on the other side of the board, particularly if black's knight repositions. Bringing the rook into the fray, this check forces the king into a more exposed position, potentially creating new weaknesses to exploit in the still complex material balance. The king scurries to the corner, seeking a sliver of safety, but the rook's menacing presence on the open file, coupled with the bishop's latent threat, suggests this sanctuary is temporary. Seizing the open file, the rook now infiltrates the enemy's back rank, a classic tactic to create immediate threats against the isolated king, potentially forcing concessions or outright disaster. Activating the bishop to a central square now aims to secure the pawn structure and prepare for a potential king hunt. Reactivating the rook's penetration potential, the black king is now firmly corralled, creating a dangerous mating net. Unleashing a surprising check, white forces a reshuffle of black's defensive structure, aiming to expose the king once it's compelled to move from its currently protected square. The black king's exposed position is a colossal liability, making this aggressive march an audacious gamble where the king dances precariously close to the white queen's influence, inviting a swift and decisive counterattack. Unleashing the pawn's final push, this move aims to seize the promotion square and force a decisive endgame scenario, effectively transforming the game's complexion from a tactical skirmish to a race against time.